Ibrahim Traoré didn't come to power through a ballot box. There were no speeches, no debates, no slow counts of votes on television. What happened on the 30th of September, 2022, in Burkina Faso was raw, abrupt, and unmistakable. A 3-4-year-old military captain took control of the nation through a coup in less than a year, and now, barely 3 years later, his name sits on a shortlist for the Nobel Peace Prize. Pause for a second, read that again. A coup leader, nominated for peace. How does that even make sense? Burkina Faso, landlocked in West Africa, has long been known more for headlines about terrorism and food insecurity than global diplomacy or peacemaking. It's one of the poorest countries on earth, with over 40% of its population living below the poverty line, and in 2022, it was spiraling. Jihadist attacks had displaced nearly 2 million people. Schools were shut, farmland abandoned. The capital, Ouagadougou, was simmering with frustration. When Traoré appeared on national television in uniform, announcing the fall of the transitional president Paul-Henri Damiba, many didn't cheer, at least, not immediately. Most were just tired. Tired of broken promises, of failed reforms, of watching their country bleed while the rest of the world offered hashtags and summits. But what happened next didn't follow the usual script of post-coup regimes. No flamboyant dictatorship, no mass arrests, no personality cult, at least not at first. Instead, Traoré pulled something entirely unexpected. He started giving things back: land, voice, hope. In his first year, he expelled French military forces, terminated ties with the IMF, and launched a series of national programs under the banner of self-reliance. It wasn't just rhetoric. By mid-2024, reports from Africa News and DW confirmed the return of millions of hectares of farmland to local communities' land that had been leased to foreign corporations for years. He slashed government spending by over 60%, diverting funds into education and healthcare. And according to a 2025 report by Sahel Watch, over 2,000 new schools had opened since his takeover. Meanwhile, 12,000 former fighters were reintegrated into society not through prisons or purges, but through vocational training and farming cooperatives. Here's where things get weird in a good way, depending on where you stand. Instead of giving long-winded speeches at global forums, Traoré was seen planting trees with farmers. Literally. A joint initiative with Mali and Niger called the Sahel Life Alliance aimed to reverse desertification by planting 800 million trees across the region. It sounded like greenwashing until satellite data began showing actual impact in the hardest-hit areas. Climate researchers started to take note, so did development economists. But not everyone was thrilled. Western diplomats were, how to put it, uncomfortable. Here was a man who rose through force, silenced Western influence, and still managed to bring a country back from the brink. France called it a concern for democratic integrity. The U.S. State Department issued a statement that sounded more like a shrug. We acknowledge the developments in Burkina Faso. The words were sterile, but the silence was loud. So here's the question. Can a nation rebuild without permission from the global order? And if it does, do we celebrate it or reject it because it didn't follow our rules? If you've got thoughts on that, leave a comment. I'm not here to hand you a side, just the contradiction, because that's what this is, a contradiction. A man who came with a gun and stayed to build. A country torn by war now teaching peace. A leader hated by the West but embraced by his farmers. And we've only just begun. For many, the contradictions didn't stop at policy. They extended into something far deeper: symbolism. It's one thing to build schools. It's another when the Pope himself speaks your name. On the 1st of July, 2025, during the Feast of All Saints, Pope Leo XIV made an unscripted remark at the Vatican. It wasn't part of a speech. It wasn't part of diplomacy, but it landed like a thunderclap. When I pray for peace, I see the face of a young soldier from Burkina Faso. A moment later, the world caught up. The Holy See formally endorsed Traoré for the Nobel Peace Prize, marking the first time in history that the Vatican backed a sitting African military leader. Conservative commentators in Europe lost their minds. African media lit up with pride. But most didn't know what to do with it. How do you respond when one of the oldest institutions of moral authority tells you that the face of peace now wears boots and carries calloused hands? it rattled assumptions. It forced the conversation to shift from ballot legitimacy to tangible outcomes, from how a man came to power to what he did with it. And let's be clear, the Nobel Committee didn't invent the hype, they responded to it. Traoré's approval ratings inside Burkina Faso, while difficult to verify due to the absence of frequent polling, were reflected through something more organic: the streets. In July 2025, following the Vatican's announcement, thousands gathered in Ouagadougou without government coordination, waving banners that read, "We no longer beg." The world listens now. Street vendors sold roasted maize and ginger beer. A group of teenage girls led chants in local dialects. There were no helicopters, no armed guards, just celebration. And the kind of unity that can't be choreographed. But unity can be fragile. And here's the mini twist: no one likes to touch. Even in the midst of hope, there's unease. Some human rights groups have expressed concern about the lack of elections. There are whispers, quiet, scattered, that opposition voices have been muted, that journalists tread carefully. It's hard to verify, harder to ignore. A leaked memo from an ECOWAS advisor in 2024 described the regime as pragmatic, yet increasingly closed. You can't pretend that doesn't matter. So we land here again, back in the gray zone. Is Traoré redefining leadership or rewriting accountability? If results are visible, does the process still matter? Tell me, what do you value more, the structure of democracy or the substance of dignity? Because that's the fork in the road. That's where this story gets uncomfortable. And if you've made it this far, chances are you've got a take. Say it, drop it in the comments, or don't. Just sit with the discomfort for a second, because we're not even halfway done. By the end of 2025, the conversation was no longer just about Burkina Faso. It was about a continent that had spent decades speaking with borrowed voices, finally choosing its own. The leaders of Mali and Niger, both also under military regimes, appeared side by side with Traoré in a historic press conference in Ouagadougou. No teleprompters, no translations. Just one shared statement, delivered in French and native dialects. This nomination is not the victory of a man. It is proof that Africa can write its own story. That line hit harder than most policy papers ever will, because it wasn't just about awards, it was about authorship, about who gets to define legitimacy and who gets to be heard. For decades, Western frameworks dominated what peace should look like: ceasefires, summits, donor conferences. But here was a coalition saying, "We're planting peace, not negotiating it." Of course, some critics saw it differently. They called it a power block of authoritarianism, a rejection of democratic values dressed up as regional solidarity. That criticism wasn't baseless either. None of these countries had held free elections since their respective coups. Civil society groups from Ghana to Senegal warned against normalizing military rule, no matter how well packaged. And yet, something else was happening beneath the surface, something that made the criticism harder to stick. Former fighters were becoming teachers. Armed rebels now ran irrigation pumps. UN observers, initially skeptical, issued internal reports in mid-2025, acknowledging a marked decrease in extremist attacks across large parts of the Sahel. Let's put that in perspective. Burkina Faso had been one of the most terror-stricken nations on earth, and now, villages once abandoned had children playing outside again. You can question the man. You can question the method, but can you question that? So here's where I pause and ask you directly. Would you rather have a perfect system on paper, or a flawed one that feeds, heals, and protects? Leave your thoughts below. Seriously. Because these questions aren't rhetorical anymore. Not when lives are involved. And in case you're still wondering if this is just optics, let's talk numbers next. Because the numbers? They're loud. If the story stopped at numbers, maybe this would be easier to digest. Maybe it could be filed away as interesting progress in a troubled region, and nothing more. But the numbers keep piling up, and they won't let the narrative settle. In less than 2 years, 2,400 schools were built across Burkina Faso. Not promised, built. Over 700 new health centers. A food subsidy program that reached 95% of rural school children. These aren't bullet points on a government website, they're villages with classrooms instead of command posts. Kids eating lunches grown by their neighbors, not imported by aid trucks. Clinics that open at dawn and don't close at sunset because the nurse lives next door. This isn't Western development metrics. It's something more raw, more rooted. And then there's the Farmers of Peace program. 1,100 former militants, men who once patrolled checkpoints with AKs, now work in coordinated agricultural units. They carry shovels. They harvest maize. Some of them still limp from old wounds. Others bring their children to the fields. According to a 2025 report by the Pan-African Agriculture Initiative, farm yields in these areas have increased by over 60%. Not despite these men, but because of them. This is where the contradiction tightens its grip. We're trained to expect violence from men who've tasted it, to believe that trauma only breeds more of the same. And yet, in village after village, something else is growing, and it's not just crops. The transition isn't perfect, let's be clear. The government still controls most of the national narrative. Opposition figures remain silent, some likely by force. There are no elections on the calendar, and for all the grassroots reform, the regime still leans heavily on centralized authority. But what makes this story so hard to dismiss is the outcome. A failing state now quietly thriving. The international response has been inconsistent at best. France, once the colonial ruler of Burkina Faso, offered what can only be described as an awkward nod. President Anne-Luc Moreau told reporters, "We may not agree with Mr. Traoré's methods, but we cannot ignore the results." Meanwhile, the United States maintained a cautious stance. Secretary of State Janet R. Collins issued a flat statement, acknowledging progress toward regional stability. The subtext? We don't like how this happened, but we can't deny what's happening. And you shouldn't either. So ask yourself this: if a country with no Western backing, no billion-dollar loans, no shiny conferences, can do this, what's stopping the rest? Is it really about governance models, or is it about who gets to write the rules? Don't answer yet. We're not done unraveling this thing. Not even close. To understand why this matters, why this isn't just a fluke, you have to look at what Traoré is pushing against. Not just the legacy of French colonialism, not just the IMF's cold arithmetic, but a worldview, a whole machinery of global development that says change only counts when it's dressed in a suit and blessed by a donor summit. Burkina Faso broke from that script, bluntly. And maybe that's why the reaction from the global north has been, let's say, allergic. The country cut ties with the IMF in 2023, canceled all pending mining contracts with foreign firms by 2024, announced a policy of national food sovereignty. If you don't grow it here, don't serve it here. That kind of language doesn't sit well in global trade circles, but it resonated elsewhere. In 2025, Brazil's President Luiz G. Costa, known for championing anti-colonial movements, said in an address, "I called him the new Sankara. He told me, I'm just a farmer in uniform." That's when I knew he was serious. The quote went viral across Latin America and West Africa. It wasn't just humility, it was a jab at the myth of heroic leadership. The idea that revolution needs a poster. Traoré refused to be one. And still he became one anyway, because the image kept spreading. In Lagos, Accra, Kinshasa, student collectives began holding forums titled Fields of Peace. Social media erupted with the hashtag Nobel for Africa. Even in places where power outages made live streaming difficult, kids projected downloaded clips of his speeches onto concrete walls, not because of what he said, but because of what he meant. A leader with mud on his boots was doing more for dignity than decades of lectures from world powers. Now, pause with that for a second. When was the last time a head of state became a symbol without branding himself as one? But here's the tension. Here's the twist that keeps the narrative from settling into a warm puddle of inspiration. Some African intellectuals are worried. Not foreign analysts, not Western watchdogs, Africans. From Dakar, from Nairobi, from Addis Ababa, they're asking, are we glorifying an exception or laying the groundwork for authoritarianism wrapped in results? In an op-ed published in June Afrique in late 2025, historian Mariam Ndiaye wrote, "We must be careful not to trade one silence for another. Development without dissent is still dangerous." That line deserves to echo, because here's the hard truth. Even a functioning machine can become a cage if no one's allowed to question it. And while Traoré's model is delivering visible outcomes, it's also consolidating power in ways that worry those who know the history of strongmen too well. So where does that leave us? With the same contradiction we began with. A man who defies the norms of power, but refuses to relinquish it. A nation healing through unorthodox methods, but lacking institutional balance. A leader whose success is undeniable, and yet, still problematic. This isn't a clean story. That's exactly why it matters. Because peace, real peace, has always been messy. Now tell me, do the rules matter more than the result? Or are we finally ready to redefine both? Leave it in the comments, or keep it to yourself. But either way, sit with the discomfort. There's one final chapter to go, and trust me, it's the one that stings. No matter how hard he tried to stay grounded, the world couldn't help but make comparisons. They came fast, from every corner of the globe, some sincere, others strategic, and a few laced with quiet panic. Brazil was among the first. President Luiz G. Costa, a longtime admirer of anti-colonial revolutionaries, gave a public address where he didn't mince words. "I called him the new Sankara," he said. But he corrected me. "I'm just a farmer in uniform." That's when I knew this wasn't performance. This was purpose. The quote spread like fire across Latin America and into Africa's youth forums. Number "farmer in uniform" trended on Pan-African social channels. It wasn't just a tagline. It was a rebellion against image-driven politics. While leaders elsewhere debated land reform in hotel lobbies, Traoré was out returning acres to farmers in worn-out boots. Whether staged or not, the optics cut deep. France, however, couldn't afford romanticism. The former colonial power had been forced out militarily, economically, and symbolically. Their diplomatic language was careful, too careful to ignore. President Anne-Luc Moreau, known for her sterile centrism, stated, "We may not agree with Mr. Traoré's methods, but we cannot ignore his results." It was the kind of sentence designed to be forgotten, polished, passive, and entirely inadequate. But buried beneath the diplomacy was discomfort. France's military, ejected after years of operating across the Sahel, now watched from a distance as security improved without them. The quiet sting? It seemed the region was healing, without its former healers. In Washington, the response was more strategic. Secretary of State Janet R. Collins acknowledged the progress toward regional stabilization, while expressing concerns about governance norms and democratic values. Translation? We see what's happening. We just don't like how you got there. And then there was Russia. President Viktor Melnikov called Traoré a builder, not of ideology, but of systems. For once, Moscow didn't overplay its rhetoric. It didn't have to. Traoré's existence alone was a geopolitical statement, a leader rejecting both Western aid and Eastern alignment, choosing instead the old-school route of local resilience. That kind of independence? Unsettling for everyone. Because here's the thing, no one could own his narrative. Not the West. Not the East. Not even the global South, really. Traoré didn't posture as a savior. He refused media grooming. He spoke through action, not platforms. And in doing so, he disrupted the script. The Nobel nomination only amplified the discomfort, not because it was undeserved, but because it blurred lines people were used to drawing. Can someone who came to power without elections be considered a peace builder? Can success ever legitimize seizure? Critics said no. Admirers said yes. But ordinary people? They didn't debate theory. They looked at facts. Extremist attacks down. Farm yields up. Clinics built. Children fed. Across the Sahel, murals of Traoré began replacing the faded logos of NGOs. Not because he demanded it, but because, for the first time in decades, people felt like the face on the wall was one of their own. So here's the question to carry into the next chapter. If results like these came from a man the world refuses to fully accept, then maybe the problem isn't the man. Maybe the problem is what he reveals about the systems that failed before him. Tell me, are we defending democracy? Or just defending the right to pretend it's working? You can drop your thoughts, or keep quiet. But either way, you're already thinking about it. And that's exactly what makes this story dangerous. You can't talk about global peacebuilding without eventually colliding with the United States. It's not just history, it's infrastructure. Since the end of World War II, America has exported a version of democracy packaged with blueprints, advisors, and sometimes bombs. Trillions spent. Dozens of interventions, all in the name of stability, freedom, peace. And yet, look at Burkina Faso. No foreign advisors, no military bases, No US aid teams issuing press releases from downtown hotels, just a country bruised by terror, picking itself up with nothing but its own calloused hands. Now hold those two images side by side. The United States in Iraq and Afghanistan, 2 decades, hundreds of thousands dead, governments installed and reinstalled like software patches. Burkina Faso, 1 coup, no elections, and yet 2,000 schools, 700 clinics, reforestation, local militias turned into farming cooperatives. It doesn't make sense, does it? And maybe that's the point. Maybe sense, as defined by global systems, has always been weighted. Maybe the success of a nation has less to do with what it follows and more to do with what it refuses to tolerate. In a recent Gallup Global Confidence Index, Burkina Faso jumped 48 spots in domestic optimism between 2023 and 2025. The US, it fell 6. A separate Pew study showed that young Africans now cite sovereignty and dignity as more important than free elections when asked about national values. In America, the same age group listed trust in the system as one of their biggest concerns. That contrast should hit harder than it does. Because while Traoré was canceling mining contracts and returning farmland, American cities were grappling with water crises in Flint, food insecurity in Mississippi, and chronic underfunding of public schools. The richest nation in history, struggling to feed its own story. And here's the uncomfortable part if you're American, and you're watching this. What does it mean when the failed state is building, and the leader of the free world is stuck? This isn't a call to glorify a military regime. It's not a rejection of democracy. But it is a challenge to the assumption that democracy, exported, is always functional, and that peace must come dressed in certain clothes, carrying the right credentials. What if peace isn't bipartisan legislation? What if it's just bread on the table and no bullets outside the school? What if you've been measuring success through headlines, while others have been building it with dirt under their nails? You don't have to agree, but you can't look away. So here's your checkpoint. If a country with no billion-dollar stimulus, no legacy institutions, no PR machine, can rebuild faster than those who claim the blueprint, then maybe it's time to stop exporting systems and start listening to those writing new ones. No hashtags, no saviors, just results. Now tell me, who's really the fragile one? Drop your thoughts, or hold them. But we're just getting to the rawest part. The contradiction's about to get louder. Let's stop for a second, not to conclude, but to clean the lens. We've been using words like peace, democracy, and leadership as if they came carved in stone. As if their definitions were fixed somewhere between Geneva and Washington. But Burkina Faso's story tears into those definitions not with theory, but with outcomes. Take peace. To many in the West, peace is the absence of conflict-signed treaties, monitored ceasefires, post-conflict reconciliation. But in Kaya, in Dori, in Wahiguya, peace looks different. It's children returning to school without being shot at. It's women farming without fear of landmines. It's soldiers building water tanks instead of patrolling them. No parades, no UN pressers. Just life, slowly returning to itself. Is that not peace? And then, democracy, the gold standard of governance. Chosen leaders, periodic elections, the consent of the governed. But what happens when a people consent, not through ballots but through food on the table and freedom from fear? Is that not a vote, cast daily with lived reality instead of paper? In a radio interview in 2025, a farmer in rural Bam province put it bluntly, "We didn't choose him on paper. We chose him because our sons came back from the bush, and now they sleep at home." That sentence deserves to be studied in political science departments, because democracy is not supposed to be a performance. It's supposed to be a relationship. And what Traoré's model is doing, dangerous as it may be, is forcing the world to confront the question, what happens when results speak louder than procedures? And what about power? Power is supposed to be corruptive, heavy, addictive, but when wielded with restraint, when it builds instead of breaks, can it still be called power? Or is it something else entirely? The absence of ego. The presence of purpose. No one saying Traoré is flawless, no one should. But the shape of his leadership raises a larger discomfort. Maybe the way we've built global systems is too focused on image and not enough on impact. Maybe we've fallen in love with aesthetics, the suited diplomat, the fluent press conference, the polished moral language. Meanwhile, the most transformative work is being done by those who don't speak the language of institutions. So now the definitions float. Peace isn't passive. It's built, bled for, sometimes seized. Democracy isn't only in ballots, it's in belonging. Power isn't always a throne. Sometimes it's a hand, lifting. And maybe that's the contradiction. Not that Traoré won a Nobel, but that we needed him to, just to start this conversation. Now take a breath. We're almost at the end, but not before we confront one last layer, the shadow beneath the shine. Because every revolution, no matter how noble, carries something unfinished. Even the best stories cast a shadow, especially the ones we want to believe in, because behind the murals and metrics, there's a layer of this story that still raises eyebrows, and it should. No elections have been held. None are scheduled. Critics within the country are quiet, too quiet for a place claiming rebirth. Independent media, still limited. The last two journalists who questioned land redistribution policies, one lost his platform, the other moved to Ghana. These aren't conspiracy theories. They're footnotes buried in reports by Amnesty West Africa and independent human rights observers, not loud, but real. Then there's the centralization of power. Traoré holds multiple key government roles, simultaneously head of state, commander of the armed forces, and chief of internal security. It's framed as temporary, of course, but we've seen that word stretch before, across decades, across continents, and the courts, still functioning under emergency law. No clear process for transition, no guardrails if things go wrong. The machinery runs smoothly now, but what happens when it doesn't? One former minister, anonymous, interviewed in early 2025, said it plainly: Traoré is efficient, but if he ever decides not to be, there's no one who can stop him. That's the risk of any revolution led by a single pair of hands. You get speed, you get clarity, but you also get silence where there should be friction. And the people, so far they believe. Because the changes are real, but belief can be a fragile currency. If schools begin to crumble, or harvests fail, or old fears return, the same people chanting his name today may one day whisper it with fear. That's not prophecy, that's pattern. We've seen this arc before. A leader rises from chaos, delivers hope, becomes the system, and then forgets the storm that made him. And maybe Traoré won't fall into that trap. Maybe he is different. But the world should still ask, should still watch. Because real peace isn't just what a leader builds, it's whether a people can speak freely while it's being built. It's whether dissent can survive even when the government is getting things right. So here we are, 9 chapters in, and the contradiction still breathes, still mutates, still holds the tension between progress and power, and that's why this story matters, because it's not over. Next, we finish where all revolutions either evolve or collapse, the question no one can answer for you, the one that turns contradiction into conviction. Here's what we know. A young soldier took power without permission. He dismantled the scripts handed to him. He fed people. He planted trees. He armed farmers with tools instead of rifles. He defied institutions, rewrote expectations, and walked barefoot through terrain where most only flew over. He silenced some critics. He skipped elections. He centralized authority and refused the familiar choreography of democracy. And still, somehow he made things work. For now, you've heard the facts. You've seen the contradictions. You've felt the discomfort. And maybe if we've done this right, you've also started asking better questions. Not about him. About us. About what we call peace, and who gets to define it. About why systems that don't work for decades still get defended with such intensity. About why results scare people more than rhetoric. About whether democracy is a process or just a permission slip. We keep stamping for systems. We're too afraid to rebuild. Because if a nation can rise without our model, then maybe our model was never the only way. So don't ask if Ibrahim Traoré deserves the Nobel. That's not the real question. The real question is, what happens if more people stop asking for permission and just start building? Now ask yourself. Would you be ready for that world? Would you even recognize it? You don't have to answer here, but someday you will.